On a hot July morning in 1994, Marcus Webb stood in the middle of a construction site in Callaway County and knew something was wrong. Not just with the job, but with the way things were going in his life, because 2 weeks earlier this had been the kind of problem he liked to show off solving, the kind of thing he'd bring a client out to watch, hands on his hips, sunglasses on, engine roaring behind him. A big machine doing exactly what he told it to do, clean, fast, impressive the way modern work was supposed to look. And now he was standing there staring at a stump that hadn't moved an inch, and there wasn't a single person on that site who didn't know it, including him, especially him, and that was the part that bothered him most, because Marcus Webb had built a reputation on being the man who got things done. No delays, no excuses, no problems he couldn't solve with the right equipment and enough push. And this thing right here, this old oak stump sitting dead center in the future entrance road to Deere Creek Estates, was quietly proving him wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically, just sitting there day after day, not moving, not giving, like it had all the time in the world, which in a way it did, because that tree had been growing there for 300 years, long before Marcus, long before the project, long before any of this land had a price tag on it. And now all that was left was the stump, wide as a small car at the base, roots spread deep and wide under the Missouri clay, and Marcus had thought it would be simple. Bring in the new Caterpillar 350, wrap the bucket around it, pull maybe an hour or two at most, and move on. That's what he told his crew. That's what he told himself. And the first time he tried it, he still believed it. He climbed into the cab himself because he liked doing that when people were watching, like showing he wasn't just a guy in a white Mercedes with his name on the door. He could still run a machine, still get his hands dirty, still make things happen. And he positioned the excavator just right, or so he thought. Lower the boom, set the bucket against the base of the stump, and started pulling, steady at first, then harder, the engine rising, the hydraulics pushing, the whole machine leaning into it. And nothing happened. Not even a shift, not even a crack in the ground, just resistance deep and stubborn. And Marcus felt that first flicker of irritation, the kind that tells you something isn't going according to plan, but instead of backing off, he pushed harder because that's what had always worked for him. More pressure, more force, more machine. And that's when the first hose blew, sharp and sudden, like a gunshot, spraying hydraulic fluid across the arm, across the dirt, across Marcus's jeans. And for a second, everything just stopped. The machine sagged, the arm dropped, and the crew went quiet, and Marcus climbed down. Try not to show how much that bothered him, told them to grab the spare, fix it, try again like it was nothing, just a small setback. And they did, because that's what crews do. They fix what breaks and wait for the next order. And they tried again, and it failed again. Another hose, another burst, another moment where the machine reached its limit and something gave, except it wasn't the stump, it was his equipment. And by the third time, even Marcus couldn't pretend this was routine anymore, because now the bulldozer had been brought in to help, pushing while the excavator pulled, two big machines working against one dead piece of wood. And still nothing, just spinning tracks, whining hydraulics, and that same unmoving stump, like it didn't care how much money you threw at it. And that's when the job stopped being a demonstration and started being a problem. A real one, because Deere Creek Estates wasn't just another project. It was supposed to be the one people remembered. 50 homes, big lots, private lake, the kind of place people drove through slowly just to look. And that entrance road had to be in by September. Buyers were closing in October. Contracts were signed. Timelines were set. And now here he was 2 weeks behind schedule, $30,000 into repairs and delays. And the one thing he needed gone was still sitting there, exactly where it had always been. And that's where we pick up, because that morning wasn't the first time Marcus had looked at that stump, but it was the first time he didn't have an answer. He stood there with Dean Curtis, his site foreman, a man who didn't talk much unless he had something worth saying. And even Dean was out of ideas. They went through the options one by one, blasting it. No permits, too close to the property line. Chemicals, too slow. Months they didn't have. Manual labor. Chainsaws, digging. Weeks of work. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and still no guarantee. And every option sounded worse than the last. And for the first time since this project started, Marcus didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't say they'd figure it out. Because he didn't know how. And that's when they heard it. Faint at first, a slow metallic clanking coming up the access road. Not the smooth hum of modern equipment. Something older, rougher, steady in a different way. And both men turned to look along with a few of the crew. And over the rise came a small crawler tractor, Orange paint faded, steel tracks biting into the dirt. No cab, no glass. Just an open seat and an old man sitting on it like he'd been there his whole life, pulling a trailer loaded with chains and pulleys and things most of the younger guys on site had probably never used. And Marcus watched it come closer with a mix of confusion and annoyance, because this wasn't part of his plan, and he didn't like things showing up uninvited on his site, especially not something that looked like it belonged in a museum. And before anyone could stop him, the old man shut the engine down, climbed off slowly, and started walking toward them. Not in a hurry, not asking permission, just walking like he had every right to be there. And Dean leaned in slightly and said under his breath, "That's Chester Holloway. Farms the property next door, been around here longer than any of us." And Marcus nodded once, still watching, arms crossing without him thinking about it. Already deciding he didn't have time for whatever this was, not today, not with everything else going on. And Chester stopped a few feet away, looked at the stump, then at the broken excavator, then back at Marcus, and said in a calm, even voice, "Looks like you've been having some trouble with that oak." And there was no judgment in it, no smile, just a simple observation. But Marcus heard it anyway, felt it land, and answered a little sharper than he meant to. "We got it handled." And Chester nodded once like he'd heard that before, like it didn't change anything, and said, "Maybe so, but I've been watching for a couple weeks now, and it doesn't look handled to me." And that was the moment. The air shifted just a little, because now it wasn't just a problem on a job site. It was a challenge, quiet, understated, but they're all the same. And Marcus felt that old instinct kick in, the one that didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone standing next to a machine that probably weighed less than one of his tracks. And he glanced back at the crawler, then at the trailer full of old gear, and then back at Chester, and said, "You thinking you can do something about it?" And Chester didn't answer right away, just looked at the stump again, took a step closer to it like he was measuring something in his head, and said, "I've pulled stumps bigger than this, just not all at once." And Marcus let out a short laugh, not loud, but enough for the crew nearby to hear, because to him that sounded ridiculous after everything they tried, after 2 weeks of failure. This old man with a small crawler and a pile of chains was telling him he could do what 2 modern machines couldn't, and part of Marcus wanted to shut it down right there. Tell him to leave, get back to work, stick to the plan, except there was no plan anymore. Just a stump and a deadline getting closer every day. And for a second, just a second, he hesitated. And that hesitation is where everything in this story starts to change, because up to that point, Marcus had been solving the problem the only way he knew how: more power, more machine, more push, and none of it had worked. And now, standing in front of him was someone who clearly didn't believe in that approach, someone who had watched him fail for 2 weeks without saying a word, and had chosen this moment, when there were no good options left, to step in, not loudly, not to prove a point, just to offer something different. And Marcus didn't trust it, didn't like it, but he couldn't ignore it either, not anymore. And that's where the Real story begins, not with the machines, not with the stump, but with 2 men looking at the same problem in completely different ways, and one of them about to find out that everything he thought he knew about solving problems might not be enough this time. Marcus didn't answer right away, and that alone told everyone standing there that something had shifted, because a week ago he would have shut the whole thing down before Chester finished his sentence, told him to get off the site and mind his own business. But now he was quiet, looking from the stump to the crawler and back again, doing the math in his head, not about horsepower or weight, but about time, money, and how few options he had left. And when he finally spoke, it came out flatter than before, less sharp, like he was already halfway to a decision he didn't like. "You're saying that thing can pull this out." And he nodded toward the old Caterpillar 20 like he didn't quite believe the words even as he said them. And Chester followed his gaze, looked at the machine, then back at Marcus and said, "No, not by itself." And that was the first thing he said that didn't sound like nonsense, not by itself. And Marcus frowned slightly, because that wasn't what he expected. He expected either confidence or stubbornness, not something that sounded almost like an explanation. And Chester went on, still calm, still not trying to impress anyone. "Your machines are trying to take it all at once. They grab hold and they pull hard, straight, fast. And if it doesn't move, something gives, usually the machine." And he glanced briefly at the broken lines hanging off the excavator arm, then back at Marcus. "What you've got there is a whole system under the ground, not just one thing. Roots going every direction, holding each other in place. You can't beat all of that at once. You got to take it apart piece by piece. And there was something about the way he said it, simple, direct, like it wasn't a theory, but something he'd done 100 times that made a couple of the guys on the crew lean in just a little, not enough to show it, but enough to listen. And Marcus caught that too, saw the shift in attention, and it irritated him more than it should have, because now this wasn't just about a stump. It was about control, about who knew what they were doing on his site. And he let out a breath through his nose, shook his head once, and said, "You're telling me that little crawler and some chains are going to do what two machines couldn't?" And this time the laugh came easier, a little louder, because that sounded closer to what he wanted this to be, something he could dismiss, something he could push away. And a few of the crew chuckled with him, not because they believed it, but because that's what you do when the boss laughs. And Chester didn't react to that either, didn't get defensive, didn't try to argue. He just stood there and let the moment pass, then said, "I'm telling you I could try a different way." And for a second, nobody said anything. And that silence sat there heavier than the laugh had, because now it wasn't a joke anymore. It was a choice, and Marcus felt it, felt the weight of it, because saying no meant going back to nothing, back to the same problem with no new answers. And saying yes meant letting this old man with a machine from another time step into the middle of his job and try something he didn't understand in front of his crew, in front of the same people who had watched him fail. And that was the part that stuck in his throat. Not the risk of failure, but the risk of being wrong in a different way, of being shown something he should have known. And he looked at Dean just for a second, and Dean didn't say much, just gave a small shrug like it was up to him, like it always was. And Marcus looked back at the stump, then at the crawler again, and finally said, "Fine, one try, that's it." And he held up a hand like he was setting terms. You get one shot at it. And if it doesn't move, we're done. And Chester nodded once, like that was fair, like that was all he needed, and said, "That's all I ever need." And then he turned and walked back toward his machine, not rushing, not looking back, just moving like a man who had already made up his mind. And that's when the crew really started paying attention, because now something was happening, something different. And Marcus stayed where he was, arms still crossed, watching, telling himself this was just a way to prove the point, to show everyone that this wasn't going to work, that there was no shortcut, no old trick that beat modern equipment. But there was a part of him, small but there, that wasn't so sure anymore. And he didn't like that part at all. And Chester climbed back onto the crawler, started it up, the engine coughing once before, settling into a steady, uneven rhythm. And instead of driving straight to the stump, he circled it slowly, once, then again, stopping here and there, climbing down, walking around it, kicking at the dirt, looking at the exposed edges where Marcus's machines had torn into the ground. And that went on longer than Marcus expected. 5 minutes, 10, 15, and the impatience started to build again, because this didn't look like work. It looked like stalling, like someone who didn't know what to do buying time. And Marcus called out across the site, "You planning on pulling it or just walking around it all day?" And a few of the guys laughed again, lighter this time, but still there. And Chester didn't answer, didn't even look up, just kept moving, studying. And after another minute, he walked back to the crawler, drove it over to the trailer, and started. Methodical, steady, not wasting movement, not explaining what he was doing unless someone asked. And one of the younger guys did. "Finally, what's all that for?" And Chester answered without looking up, "I'm not pulling the stump. I'm pulling the roots that are holding it one at a time." And that was the first time anyone there heard the plan in plain words. And it hung in the air for a second, simple enough to understand, but different enough to feel new. And Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. Because now it wasn't just some vague idea. It was a method, and methods can be right or wrong. And if this one worked, then everything he had been doing for the past 2 weeks hadn't just been unlucky. It had been wrong, and that thought landed harder than anything else so far. And he pushed it aside, focused instead on the setup, on the chains, on the angles, telling himself it didn't matter how clever it looked if it didn't move that stump. And Chester finished setting the last line, checked each connection, each hook, each anchor point, then walked back to the crawler, wiped his hands on his jeans, and climbed up into the seat. And before he started, he looked once more at the stump, not like he was challenging it, not like Marcus had, but like he was confirming something, like he already knew how this was going to go. And Marcus stood there, watching, waiting, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he wasn't sure what was about to happen next. And that uncertainty, more than the stump, more than the broken machines, was what held him there, silent, as Chester reached for the controls and began to take up the slack in the first chain. The crawler eased forward just enough to take the slack out of the first line, And you could hear it before you could see it, the chain tightening link by link, the pulleys shifting into place with a low creak that sounded older than anything else on that site. And then it went still. Everything went still, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting to see if anything at all was going to happen. And for a moment, nothing did. Just that steady engine, that slow pull, nothing dramatic. Nothing like the violent jerks Marcus had been putting into it with the excavator. And that alone was different enough to make a few of the guys glance at each other because they were used to noise, speed, power being obvious. And this didn't look like any of that. This looked like patience. And Marcus stood there watching, arms loose at his sides now, not crossed anymore, eyes fixed on the line running from the crawler to the base of the stump, telling himself this was going nowhere, that he'd seen this before, pressure building, something giving. Only this time it wasn't building fast. It wasn't pushing to a breaking point. It was just pulling, steady, constant. And then Dean said it first, low, almost to himself there, and Marcus followed his gaze to the ground just off the north side of the stump, where the clay had started to shift. Not much, just a hairline crack opening up where there hadn't been one a second before. And Marcus leaned forward slightly without realizing it, because that was new. That hadn't happened before, not once in 2 weeks, and the crawler kept moving, slow, almost stubborn its pace, and the chain stayed tight, and that crack widened just enough to be real, not imagined. And then there was a sound, deep and dull, like something giving way underground, not snapping clean, more like breaking loose, and a section of root rose just slightly, barely visible unless you were looking for it. And Chester didn't react, didn't speed up, didn't celebrate. He just kept the throttle steady, and the crawler pulled a little more. And then with a low, heavy pop, the first root came free, lifting up out of the ground just enough to show itself, dirt falling off in clumps. And for a second, nobody said anything because they weren't sure what they'd just seen. And then one of the guys let out a quiet "no way," and Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not belief, not yet, but something close to it, something he didn't want to name. And Chester eased off, stopped the crawler, let the line go slack, climbed down like it was just another step in a process, and walked over to the stump, checked the root, nudged it with his boot, then moved the chain, rehooked it a little further along, changed the angle just slightly, and went back to the seat. And Marcus watched all of it, every movement. Because now it mattered. Now, this wasn't just a show. This was progress, real progress. And when the crawler pulled again, the second line tightening, the same thing happened, slower than Marcus expected, quieter than he was used to, but undeniable, the ground shifting, another crack, another deep sound from under the surface, and then another root giving way. And this time a couple of the crew actually stepped closer, like they needed to see it up close to believe it. And Marcus didn't stop them. Didn't say anything, he just stood there, watching the stump the way he hadn't been able to watch it before, because before it had been an opponent he thought he could overpower, and now it was something else, something that was being taken apart piece by piece right in front of him, and he could feel that difference, could feel the way the tension in the air had changed, less frustration, more focus, and Chester kept working, no rush, no wasted movement, pull, stop, adjust, pull again, each time from a slightly different direction. Each time targeting a different part of what held that stump in place. And with every pull something gave, not everything, not all at once, but enough to matter, enough to change the shape of the problem. And Marcus found himself stepping closer without thinking about it. Close enough now to see the way the chains were set, the way the pulleys multiplied the pull, the way the force wasn't just forward, it was angled, directed. And for the first time it clicked, not fully, not like Chester understood it, but enough for Marcus to see that this wasn't about how much force you could apply, it was about where you applied it. And that thought hit harder than the first broken root, because it meant something simple had been sitting right in front of him the whole time, something he hadn't seen. And the crawler pulled again, and the stump shifted just slightly a tilt, maybe an inch, but it was the first time the whole thing had moved as one. And that was enough to make a few of the guys laugh. Not mocking now, but surprised, impressed, and Marcus didn't laugh. He just stared, because that inch meant more than anything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. It meant the stump wasn't immovable. It meant it had limits, and someone had just found them. And Chester kept going, working his way around, changing positions, pulling from the east side now, then the west, always steady, always controlled. And the more he worked, the looser the stump became, the ground around it, breaking up, the roots that had held it tight for centuries giving way one by one. And Marcus could feel something else happening too. something inside him, something that felt a lot like his certainty slipping, because every pull that worked was another reminder that his way hadn't, and that was harder to accept than the problem itself. And he glanced at Dean again, but this time Dean didn't shrug, didn't look uncertain. He was watching the work with a kind of quiet respect, like he'd seen something like this before, or maybe just understood it better. And Marcus followed his gaze back to Chester, to the way he handled the machine, not fighting it, not forcing it, just letting it do what it was built to do. And that's when Marcus realized something he hadn't thought about before, that Crawler wasn't failing because it wasn't being pushed past its limits. It was working because it was being used the way it was meant to be used. And that idea sat there in his mind, uncomfortable and clear at the same time. And Chester stopped again, stepped down, walked over to the stump, now visibly loosened in the ground, dirt broken up around it, roots exposed and snapped. And he took a moment just looking at it, like he was deciding what came next. And Marcus found himself wanting to ask, wanting to know what he saw, what he was thinking, but he didn't. He just waited along with everyone else, because now this wasn't a show anymore. And Chester moved one last chain, thicker than the others, wrapped it low and tight around the base, checked the line, then walked back to the crawler, slower this time, more deliberate, and climbed up into the seat. And when he started the engine again, it sounded the same as before, steady, unbothered, but everything around it felt different, because now everyone on that site knew something was about to happen. Not hoped, not guessed, but knew. And Marcus stood there, not saying a word, not moving, watching that old machine line up for what looked like the final pull. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he wasn't thinking about how to fix the problem. He was just waiting to see how it was going to be finished. Chester didn't rush the last setup. And that was the first thing Marcus noticed, because everything up to that point had been steady, controlled, almost quiet. But now there was a weight to it, like the work had been building toward this one pull the whole time. And Chester walked the line once more, hand running along the chain, checking each link without looking like he needed to, just confirming what he already knew. Then he set his boot against the base of the stump and gave it a short push. Not to move it, just to feel it. And when he stepped back, there was the smallest nod, almost nothing, but it was enough to tell anyone watching that he was ready. And Marcus felt that more than he saw it, because the air around the site had changed again, the chatter gone. Even the guys who had been talking under their breath earlier were quiet now, standing still, watching, because they all knew this was it. Whatever was going to happen now. And Chester climbed up into the crawler, settled into the seat like he'd done 1,000 times before, one hand on the control, one on the throttle. And he didn't look at Marcus, didn't look at the crew. He looked straight ahead at the line, at the work in front of him. And when the engine picked up just a little, not much, just enough to take the slack out of that last heavy chain, you could feel it before you could see it, that tension running through the system, through the pulleys, through the ground itself. And Marcus found himself holding his breath without meaning to, because this wasn't like the earlier pulls. Those had been steps. This felt like a finish, and the chain went tight. Not snapping, not jerking, just tightening until there was nothing left to give. And then the crawler leaned into it, slow, deliberate, the tracks biting down into the dirt. And for a second, nothing moved, and that second stretched long enough for doubt to creep back in, long enough for Marcus to think maybe this was where it stopped. Maybe this was where the old machine finally hit its limit the same way as had. And then the ground shifted, not in one place, but across the whole base of the stump, a deep movement, like something large underneath was finally letting go. And there was a sound, low and heavy, not sharp, not clean, more like something tearing loose after holding on for too long. And the stump lifted, not all at once, but enough to break the line it had held for centuries. And that was the moment. Everything changed, because once it moved, it kept moving, the chain pulling, the crawler holding steady, and the last of the deep roots gave way one after another, not in neat breaks, but in heavy, uneven releases that you could feel through the ground. And then it happened. The whole stump came up, slow at first, then all at once, rising out of the earth with a weight that made it clear just how much had been hidden below the surface, dirt falling. Away from it, roots trailing, long and thick and tangled. And for a second, it didn't look like a piece of wood at all. It looked like something that had been buried and was now being pulled back into the light. And when it cleared the hole and rolled onto its side with a heavy thud, the sound carried across the site, final, undeniable. And then there was silence, real silence, not the kind where people are waiting, but the kind where nobody quite knows what to say because they've just seen something they didn't expect to see. And Marcus stood there at the edge of that hole, staring at it, not at the stump anymore, but at the space it had left behind, 15 feet down, wider than he thought it would be. Raw earth where something had held fast for 300 years and was now gone. And his mind was trying to catch up, trying to line up what he knew with what had just happened. And it didn't fit, not cleanly, not the way he liked things to fit, because everything he had done had been stronger, bigger, faster, and none of it had worked. And this slow, steady, patient pull had done it in under 4 hours, and there wasn't any way around that, no way to explain it away. And behind him, the crew broke first, voices rising, not loud, but enough, a couple of laughs, a few words, shaking heads, the kind of reaction you get when something simple turns out to be right, and you didn't see it coming. And Marcus didn't turn around, didn't join in, he just stood there, looking, down into that hole. And after a moment, he heard the engine cut, the crawler going quiet, and then the sound of boots on dirt, slow steps coming up beside him, and Chester stopped next to him, not close, just near enough. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke. They both just looked at the hole. And finally, Chester said, "That ought to do it, plain simple, like the job had been no different than any other." And Marcus let out a breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, not sharp, not defensive, just honest in a way it hadn't been all morning. How? And it wasn't a challenge anymore. It wasn't a demand. It was a real question, the kind a man asks when he knows he missed something important. And Chester didn't rush that answer either. He took a second, looked out across the site, then back at the hole, and said, "You were trying to beat it all at once, more force, more machine. Nothing wrong with that. Most of the time that works. But not with something like this. This thing's been holding on longer than you and I've been around. You don't beat that by hitting it harder. You beat it by taking away what it's holding on with one piece at a time." And Marcus listened, really listened, not interrupting, not pushing back, because now the words matched what he had seen, and that made them land differently. And Chester went on, not looking at him now, just talking like he was finishing a thought. "Machines don't think, they just do what you tell them. So if you tell them to fight the whole thing, that's what they'll try to do, and something's going to give, either the machine or the ground. But if you use them to work the problem, not fight it, you get a different result." And that was it. No long speech, no lesson dressed up as anything more than what it was. And Marcus nodded once, slow, because that was all he could do, because there wasn't anything to argue with, not after what he had just watched. And for the first time since this whole thing started, he felt something close to relief. Not just because the stump was gone, but because the problem had an answer, a real one, even if it wasn't the one he expected. And he turned then, finally, looking back at the crawler, the chain still lying on the ground, at the machine he had dismissed less than an hour ago. And he saw it differently now, not as something small or outdated, but as something built for a purpose he hadn't understood. And Chester stepped away, already moving back toward his equipment, like the job was done and there was nothing more to say. And Marcus watched him go for a second, then said, "Wait." And Chester stopped, turned slightly, and Marcus took a step forward, not quite sure how to say what he was about to say, because it wasn't something he was used to saying, not on his site, not in front of his crew. "I owe you." And Chester shook his head once, easy, like he'd heard that before too. "You don't owe me anything. I pulled a stump, that's all." And Marcus almost pushed it, almost insisted, but something in the way Chester said it made him stop, made him realize this wasn't about money, wasn't about settling up. And Chester added after a moment, "You want to do something? Just remember what was here before all this." And Marcus frowned slightly, not understanding yet. And Chester nodded toward the land around them. This wasn't always a job site. And then he turned back to his crawler, like that was enough explanation, and climbed up, and the engine came back to life, that same steady sound. And as he started to pull away, towing his trailer of chains and pulleys behind him, Marcus stood there at the edge of that empty hole, watching him go. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next step in the project. He was thinking about what he had just seen and what it meant and how close he had come to missing it completely. Chester didn't wait for anything after that, didn't stand around to be thanked or watched. He just drove the crawler back the way he came, slow and steady, the chains clinking behind him, and within a few minutes he was over the rise and out of sight, like he'd never been there at all. And that left Marcus standing in the middle of his own job site with a hole in the ground where the problem used to be, and a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Something close to being checked, not beaten, not. embarrassed in a loud way, but corrected in a way that stayed with you. And the crew started moving again, because that's what crews do when the work's ready. Someone grabbed a radio, someone else started talking about grading, and Dean walked up beside Marcus, looked down into the hole once more, then at him, and said, "We can get the road in now." And Marcus nodded, because that part was simple again, the path forward was clear, but he didn't move right away, didn't jump back into the next. Tasked the way he usually would, he stood there another minute, just long enough for what had happened to settle in. And then he turned, walked back toward his truck, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he wasn't thinking about how to force something to work. He was thinking about how close he'd come to doing it wrong all the way through. And that thought didn't leave him, not that day, not the next, and not in the months that followed as Deer Creek Estates moved forward the way it was always supposed to. The road went in, the lots were graded, houses started going up, buyers came through, contracts closed, everything on schedule again, and from the outside it looked like the project had gone exactly as planned. But Marcus knew better, because every time he drove past that entrance, every time he saw the curve in the road where that stump had been, he remembered standing there with no answer, and then watching someone else solve it in a way he hadn't even considered, and that memory stayed sharp, not fading like most job details do. And it showed up in small ways at first, in the way he handled problems, in the way he listened a little longer before jumping in the way he stopped assuming that bigger meant better every time. And the people who worked with him noticed it, not all at once, not as some big change, but in the way he asked different questions, in the way he brought in guys who knew older methods, in the way he kept certain tools around that he would have laughed at before. And he didn't talk about it much at first, didn't make a point of it, but there was one thing he did do that surprised people, and that was the marker at the entrance, solid stone piece set just off the road where everyone coming in would see it. And when the homeowners association saw it, they asked about it, because it didn't match the polished look of the development. And Marcus told them it was staying no discussion, and what it said wasn't long, wasn't dressed up, just a few lines about the land being farmed for over 100 years before any of this was built, about the people who worked it, about the fact that what stood there now hadn't always been there. And when people asked him why he insisted on it, he didn't give a long explanation. He just said it mattered. And that was enough. And in his office, among the plans and the contracts and the things that kept his business moving, there was a photograph that hadn't been there before. An old black and white image Chester had given him a few weeks after that day, of a younger man standing next to that same crawler. His father, thin, worn, steady the machine behind him, looking almost exactly the same as it had when it pulled that stump. And Marcus kept that photo where he could see it, not as a reminder of a mistake, but as a reminder of something he hadn't known before. And over time, when people asked about it, he told the story, not all at once, not as some big lesson, just pieces of it, how he tried to force a problem and failed, how someone else had approached it differently and made it work, and he didn't leave out the part where he laughed, didn't? Skip over that, because that was part of it too, and the men who heard understood what he was saying without him needing to spell out. And years passed the way they do. Jobs came and went, equipment got replaced, project got bigger, and Marcus kept building, still driving his Mercedes, still doing the work, but not quite the same way as before. And over on the edge of that development, Chester kept farming as long as he could, the crawler still running, still used when it needed to be, until the day came when he stepped back and let his son take over. And when Chester passed, people showed up, more than you'd expect, men who had worked land, men who had worked machines, men who understood what it meant to do something the right way even when nobody was watching. And Marcus was there too, standing a little off to the side, not saying much, just paying his respects. And afterward he found Chester's son, Robert, and they talked for a few minutes, not about the funeral, not about the past in a sentimental way, but about that day with the stump. And Marcus handed him a check, something Chester had never asked for and never taken, and Robert looked at it, surprised, and Marcus told him it was for the work his father had done and for what it had saved him, not just in money, but in something harder to measure. And Robert nodded, understood, and said it would go to something his father would have approved of, something that kept that kind of knowledge from disappearing. And that could have been the end of it, just a story told and remembered by the people who were there. But it didn't end there, because years later, when Marcus's own son stepped into the business and took on his first big project, something happened that sounded familiar. Another site, another entrance road, another stump in the way, not as big, not as old, but enough to stop progress. And the younger Webb did what his father had done, brought in the machines, pushed harder, expected it to move, And when it didn't, when the delays started, when the frustration built, Robert Holloway drove up in that same crawler, older now, but still running, still ready, and the foreman on that site recognized it before the son did and told him who it was. And when Robert walked over, he didn't start by offering help. He started by asking for a phone, and the son, confused but willing, called his father, put him on speaker, and when Marcus heard the name Holloway and the sound of that engine in the background, there was a pause, just long enough to tell everyone listening that he knew exactly what was happening. And then he laughed, not the same laugh as before, not sharp, not dismissive, but something quieter, something that carried understanding. And he said, "Let him show you, don't interrupt, just watch." And that was all the instruction he gave, because that was all that was needed. And over the next few hours, the same process played out again, not identical, not rehearsed, but following the same idea. Take it apart, don't fight the whole thing. And when the stump came out, when the ground gave way and the problem was gone, the son asked the same question Marcus had asked years before: how? And Robert gave him the same kind of answer his father had given, simple, direct, nothing extra, and the lesson passed on without needing to be dressed up. And somewhere between that first failure and that second success, something had changed in the way the Webb family did their work, not in the tools they used, not in the scale of what they built, but in the way they looked at problems when they didn't move the first time. And if you go out to Deere Creek Estates today, if you drive in slow enough to notice, you'll see that marker still standing near the entrance. And most people pass it without reading because they're focused on the houses, on the lake, on what's there now. But if you stop, if you take a second and look, you'll see a reminder of what used to be there, and of a day when a problem that couldn't be forced was solved another way. And that's the part that stays, not the machines, not the cost, not the schedule, but the understanding that sometimes the thing you're pushing against isn't going to give just because you push harder, and the only way through it is to stop, look at it differently, and work it the way it needs to be worked, whether it's a stump in the ground or anything else that refuses to move.